Welcome to this Euranet Plus debate on freedom of movement presented within the Citizens Corner concept. The debate is produced and hosted by Euranet Plus and RTBF Belgium, a member of the Euranet Plus network. The debate can be followed live in the European Parliament on Euranet Plus Inside website, on our Facebook profile as well as on Twitter using the hashtag Citizens Corner. I'm Brian Maguire. Joining us today to discuss freedom movement in Europe, Timothy Kirkhope, a Conservative MEP from the United Kingdom, Jean Lambert, a Green MEP from the United Kingdom, and Sigrid Muresan, a centre-right Romanian MEP and Vice Chair of the Committee on Budgets. We're also joined by students from the Euranet Plus campus radio networks, Larissa Buildea and Larissa Antal from Babasboy University and UBB Radio in Romania, and José Jordão from the University of Vigo in Spain. Welcome to you all. Timothy, let's start with you. You're working a lot on data and PNR, things like that at the moment. How do you sense, in general terms, the freedom movement debate is going? Is there really a pushback against freedom of movement?
I'm not sure that's right. I think that member states are doing what they're perfectly entitled to do, and that is to, while supporting the whole principle of freedom of movement, they're looking at the nature of the people that are actually moving. Certainly in my case, of course, I'm looking at the issues about security for the citizens. So whilst I acknowledge people can move, I want to be very careful that the people that are moving around and into Europe are not there to do us harm. They're not going to be committing terrorist offences, or they're not involved in major criminality. And I think also the other thing that the nation states are doing at the moment is looking at the whole issue of the things that attach to people who move, such as the benefits system, which of course is a matter for each individual country to determine, health and benefits and so on. And I think that's perfectly legitimate, and I know that it's been done in France and elsewhere, but I think also now in Britain it's an important issue. Freedom of movement, yes, but obviously protection of our citizens as well. Okay,
Jean, do you think the balance is right and moving in the right direction?
Well, I think that in terms of the direction in which it's moving, I think there are a lot more critical voices on it than there were maybe sort of 10 years ago. And I think part of that is being stoked by a very particular form of politics, which then begins to sour the debate, so that, you know, for people that do actually want to have a sort of a calmer debate about what this means, how you manage it, you know, what the implications are, it begins to become something which is very much attached to either particular countries, particular groups within the European Union. I mean, I think that, you know, what we've seen in the UK with the conflation of Roma and Romanian is something that, you know, has been very, very detrimental to this, which is actually one of the cornerstones of the European Union.
Okay, Sigrid, do you see lazy politics at work here when people use the immigration system and then conflate that with freedom of movement, and we end up with a repulsion of workers?
Yes, absolutely. So you definitely shouldn't mix the one with the other. The freedom of movement is a fundamental principle which we're having in the European Union. It's about that. It's about British citizens being able to travel and to live wherever they want in any other European state, about German citizens, Romanian citizens being able to do the same. So that's an absolute principle. It's unquestionable. The benefits of it are absolutely far bigger than the costs and the risks. And there should be no limitations to this freedom of movement. And I think the freedom of movement has never been about criminals traveling or so on. Of course, we have institutions of the state, we have police in each of our member states. The police should cooperate given and within the European framework as much as they can, and so should all other institutions of the state in tackling criminality and so on. But the freedom of movement has definitely enriched our lives, our economies, improved the way in which SMEs do businesses across borders much more than it has affected it. But concerning, just very briefly, the abuses of the systems, of the social systems, that should definitely be done. We can come back to that.
Okay. Jose, you have a question for the panel.
Yeah, I got some questions. Just one. Are those measures to controlling jihadist attacks or for stopping immigration all over Europe?
I think Jose is referring to the Spanish Interior Minister who wants to revisit the Schengen treaty and to stop jihadis. So is this really about stopping jihadis? Is this about member states trying to take a bit more control in terms of the employment situation?
Is Europe endangered by jihadists because we have the Schengen area? Who were the attackers? Where was the cause of the terrorist attacks? For example, in France at the beginning of the year, it was French citizens born in France, who grew up in France, who attacked within France. So with or without Schengen, we would have had it. So definitely we need to provide answers to the concerns of the citizens, partly also linked to the rise of the Islamic State, of jihadists and so on. So definitely we need to provide an answer there, but Schengen was not part of the problem there.
Timothy?
Well, no, I mean Schengen, of course, those member states in Schengen do
which
have...
the UK isn't.
Which the UK is not. UK and Ireland are not in it. But I think that they certainly have the right, every right, in an emergency situation to look at the way in which the open borders policy of Schengen works. That's already written into the Schengen protocols. In this particular case, obviously I can't second guess what the minister was actually up to, but clearly he is expressing some concern of another kind, which is to do with the radicalization and the return to Europe of some people who have actually been out elsewhere in the world and have actually come back with some bad motives, and that is something which I think obviously a national security minister should be perfectly entitled to consider. Whether it's right that he could then use that in order to have some kind of special deal on Schengen, that's a matter which I'm not really able to comment on.
Okay, Jean, do you think the treaty will be revisited, or do we have the instruments already in place to manage this?
I think we have a lot of the instruments in place already to manage this. As Timothy said, that if you're in an emergency situation, the Schengen Agreement allows you to take action. That if what you're trying to do is to give an appearance of being able to control something which actually is very difficult to control in that way, then you're also almost implying to your citizens that there are simple steps that you can take to actually solve a complex problem. And in this particular case, whether it's on terrorism, whoever's responsible for it, as was just said, Schengen is not part of the problem here.
Okay. Larissa, you have a question?
Yes, Romania is technically prepared to do part a long time of Schengen area. But still this country isn't a member of Schengen. Why is the reason?
Siegfried.
Well, look, as a Romanian MEP, I'm not the most suitable person to answer this question, but briefly, the honest answer, I think, is the following. Romania, Bulgaria, every country which wants to join the Schengen area needs to fulfill certain technical criteria. Romania has been doing that. All of the evaluations done by the European Commission, and the European Commission is the institution habilitated to basically give its opinion on whether the technical requirements are fulfilled. The European Commission has repeatedly said that Romania fulfills the technical requirements, so we are in a position to securely defend an external border of the Schengen area. While, on the basis of this technical on the basis of this technical report, the Ministers of Justice and Interior of the European Union need to make this decision and grant Romania the access to the Schengen area, and they have been postponing this for a couple of years, mainly due to lack of trust. The Schengen area is also a question of trust. Do we fulfill the technical criteria? Yes, we do. Do other Schengen countries fully trust that Romanian authorities would use the technical capacities which they have and enforce the rule of law, controls, tackle trafficking of human beings, of drugs, of whatever? And the answer so far by all ministers has been a political answer, and it has been that the country is not yet ready.
Okay.
And my last sentence is the regular report on the monitoring of the judiciary in Bulgaria and Romania says that the judiciary in Romania, so the institutions, the key institutions of the state, anti-corruption, high courts, prosecutors and so on, are more and more fulfilling the mission. The risks still lie with the political class, with those politicians who are trying to abuse the institutions for their own good.
You share this view, Timothy?
Well, the situation is, of course, that in the case of Britain, certainly in Ireland, for a number of reasons, including their geographical locations and so on, the nature of those countries, are not members of Schengen. However, Schengen is not just one thing. It is not just you sign up to Schengen and you're in everything in Schengen. There are protocols, and you can join some of them. I mean, the British are actually members of certain protocols in cooperation terms and so on, and other countries have different levels at which they have been involved as they progress towards full membership. So it's a kind of emerging situation, really.
We have a question on Facebook. Jean, you take this one. The problem is not Schengen, says Giorgio, but the fact that some countries have to control the EU borders by themselves. Why don't we have a real EU police force for our common borders? You'd love that, wouldn't you?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I think that the reason that we don't have one, well, there are a number of reasons. One is that this is something that, you know, it's almost the last ditch that member states actually want to give up, is any sort of control of their external borders, in that sense, to, you know, to the rest of the world. I think it's also a question about what's the capacity to manage it. You know, that what sort of infrastructure would you then need at the European level to actually really be able to deliver on this? Would member states be willing to make a contribution? I don't think they would, and this is the argument about the own resources for the budget, you know, that we have to move away from simply relying on member states stumping up whatever they want to give. So I think there are a whole set of questions about the democratic oversight as well of such an institution. I've
got another question here, Timothy, on PNR, which is related. The PNR won't avoid national terrorists making attacks in their own country. So why is it so important to have one? It's from Lenka.
Well, I mean, there are certain cases. It's very difficult to take a specific case and say this proves the use of PNR. But I know for a fact, through certainly the discussions we've had with law enforcement authorities and indeed many others, that in actual fact, in many cases, PNR would be an invaluable weapon in dealing with the movement of not only terrorists or those with a terrorist intent, but also major criminals, people involved in human and child trafficking and so on. These are the sort of people we want to really deal with. And their movements into Europe, often in a circuitous way, will only really come to light to the authorities through a PNR system. And I have been arguing for some time to get this system. I'm not suggesting it's a silver bullet at all, but it is an important ingredient in the fight against crime.
It's true, isn't it, that some terrorists use Dusseldorf, for example, to fly into because there's no PNR, there's no monitoring level there, which is different in other countries.
I mean, terrorists are very sophisticated nowadays. Major criminals are very sophisticated. They use technology. They have all these abilities and so on. The difficulty we have is that unless you have a European system in place where we can actually exchange information in a reliable way and with safeguards, you are going to allow the criminals to find the gaps. They're always looking for the gaps. They're always looking for the weak spots. And as long as we don't have a universal system, a proper system in place, they will find those gaps and cause us mischief.
Okay. Lucy, you have a question?
Yes. What is more important, the security or the person who travel for work?
Okay, so we have a tendency to say our country is not safe, so all foreigners stay out. Which should we be shouting about more, the freedom to work or the freedom to protect our member states? Siegfried?
Look, there's definitely no contradiction in between the two. And as we've also discussed before, criminals are very often coming from their own countries and so on and so on. And the benefits of free movement are definitely bigger than the shortcomings, the risks. So I see no contradiction. But of course, in order to have a Europe whole and free in which you can travel, choose, you can live wherever you want, travel, study wherever you want, as a young person, of course, authorities should cooperate more. The law should be enforced. And what you were asking before about loopholes is very important, because we are only as secure as our weakest link. In a world in which, as you rightly also said, that the terrorists are always up to the newest technologies and so on. So definitely, if a terrorist enters into contact with an authority in any city, in any region of Europe, information should be spread in a way in which whatever his track record is in relation with one authority, it should be known by other authorities as well.
Timothy,
in our democracies, you cannot have freedom without security, and in my view, you cannot have security unless you have freedom, or the proper controls over security, and the balance has to be right. So there's no contradiction, that's correct. But we do need to have both.
Okay. Marine Le Pen, in her great wisdom, has said that François Hollande should suspend the Schengen area visa system and to strip dual nationals of French citizenship if they carry out barbaric crimes, which would implicitly say that she's quite happy for them to keep them if they don't do barbaric crimes. Should we... How do you fight back against nationalist politicians who will use every opportunity to discriminate against foreign nationals? Jean?
Well, there's no easy answer on that, but I do think part of it is about values, and the values that actually join people of goodwill.
Which are? What are those values?
I think that there are values about freedom. There are values about democracy. There are values about respect for difference. And that I think those sort of values are extremely important. And I think that, you know, most of our countries actually really try to promote those sort of values, because the minute you start singling out groups on the basis of whether it's their faith, whether it's their colour, you know, whatever, you are acting in a way which actually divides your society. I've just come back from Pakistan. And there, you know, they are really grappling with a horrendous problem about terrorism, and they are very, very clear, many of the people there, that on that basis, it's a very tiny percentage of the country which creates the problem. It's the same with us, and therefore to actually, as it were, close down the freedoms and to pretend that somehow there is an innate superiority is a way of continuing division. It's a way of actually creating the problems, not solving them.
Timothy, the freedom movement is not about values essentially to begin with. It's about the economy. The whole structure is about boosting the economy, labour mobility, getting the best talent in the right place at the right time. Have we lost sight of that?
Well, I think we're in very complicated political processes, and we have seen around Europe some emerging extremism and so on, which seems to be muddling things up a little bit, frankly. My own feeling is that as far as the European Union is concerned, the freedom of movement is very important. But it has to be freedom of movement for the right reasons, and not for the wrong reasons. But having said that, I mean, the Le Pen sort of, I'm not quite sure whether as a result of these actions we're going to see a lot of stateless French people, former French people. I'm not sure where they're going to be. I would suggest I would suggest there are going to be more problems, many more problems, if we end up with that sort of situation from France. I think that's a very,
absolutely,
I think, rather ridiculous proposal.
We're terribly surprised. Let's see one more soon. Larissa, another question? Jose.
For me. Don't you think it's more important integration politics than controlling politics?
Siegfried, are our integration policies working? Do people really understand how the coordination works?
Look, they are working, but they definitely have to be improved.
What needs improved?
And I think Europe as a whole, you know, when we say more Europe, we want more integration, it should also be about better Europe, about fixing those things which do not work for the time being, also within the institutions, and we're doing, in fact, what people expect from us to do, cutting red tape, simplifying the rules, making them more transparent. So there are rules which every country needs to obey, and they have the legal framework to do that. But it's up to them to implement them and to basically also build up the administrative capacities. And when you see extreme anti-European politicians trying to sell us that whatever happens evil, which is a result of their own failures of the national or regional administrative capacities, is in fact to be blamed on Europe, that is in fact, you know, the lowest that you can get as a politician.
Timothy, is this... Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, integration. There are two forms of integration. One is the internal integration in countries. I used to be not only the immigration minister in the UK, but also the race relations minister. And I was very interested in making sure that communities within the UK were integrated and happy. And you know, I think that was very much part of my job, as much as it was to either reject or accept applications to come to the country through immigration laws. However, the integration of Europe is a different issue. It does seem to me that it is... the strength of Europe, to my opinion anyway, has always been built on the cooperative effect of nation states with their own traditions and their own culture and all the rest of it, and working together in a very cooperative manner. We don't seem to have achieved that. Some people politically are just going for integration of Europe, integration of Europe. What they don't understand is that we haven't yet achieved all we can achieve in cooperation, and where we have managed to do it, we have had enormous successes, and it has improved the atmosphere.
Where have we done it where it's been successful?
Well, I mean, we're talking about security issues, for instance. We've done an awful lot of work, certainly between our law enforcement agencies, which has been very successful indeed in terms of protecting people already, even without PNR, even without the latest round of security measures. They have worked together. We have actually kept our people much safer as a result.
Okay.
And, that's an example, but there's many other examples too in many fields.
Okay, this level of integration that Timothy talks about and the success, to some extent at least, of the security and law enforcement, do you think that there's a greater momentum towards this integration because of external threats from Russia, for example, that we kind of feel more European because, like you say, we have shared values? Do you think this helps?
I think it's working in sort of almost two ways. That there's certainly a part of it which actually makes people look at, okay, what do we need to be doing better together? On the other hand, I think we're also seeing a push too to actually people going back to their own sense of national security. And I think if you look at that on energy, for example, you're really seeing that a lot of the ideas about what we could do together, I mean, I know that we're talking about energy union, etc. now, but nevertheless, there are a number of national policies which I think are like, if we're going to be specific, sort of Poland and the continuing push for coal, continuing push for shale gas, working against some of the other policies that we've had in terms of how we tackle climate change. And that part of that is also due to external forces and the relationship with Russia about security of energy supplies, etc. So I think, we're at a point where if we're not very careful, we actually almost begin to lose any sense of what is it that we are actually trying to do collectively and our role in the world. And that, I think, we really need to spend a bit of time on vision, not just the nuts and bolts.
Let's compare a little with the United States. We say, the Americans tend to do these things better, but look at the complexity of their system, which is supposed to be harmonized. We're supposed to be able to move from state to state. Would you want to live in Arizona with the discrimination policies they have if you're a particular color? And is this level of discrimination any different in America? And do they actually benefit more from a single system? Siegfried.
Look, I think, of course, always looking to the US and comparing ourselves with them. I mean, we are 28 different nations, 28 governments. We have competence at national level, which we would never be ready to give up to the European level, and rightly so. So I think by default, always comparing and contrasting the two countries is not healthy. What I think, should be the main objective for us Europeans is also in terms of mobility, to make mobility finally working, and especially, keep the best, the brightest of the young people within Europe. Because if, as a Romanian citizen, you are moving and living, say, 3 or 4 years because you feel there's more opportunity in London or Berlin or so on, that's fine. If you feel there's more opportunity at home, you would then, I'm sure, return to your home country in 2 or 3 years. But if you're leaving Europe for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the US, it's much harder to return. So what I would want us to do is make the best use of the framework which we have. Don't always compare ourselves with the US, and make sure that in fact everyone, and especially the brightest, but really everyone in Europe can travel freely, study, work, live wherever they want in Europe, of course, by obeying the rules. And as I said, keeping them in Europe is, I think, essential for moving the continent forward.
So we need to keep our talent in Europe, Timothy. Yep. Is there something which is holding us back from doing that?
Well, I mean, I think in a way, yes, we would like our talent to stay in Europe. We would like a lot of people also to come and contribute to the work we do. And we would like to also export some of our talent to other parts of the world where we think they can be really effective in perhaps molding things slightly better. I think it's got to be a moving. You mentioned freedom of movement in Europe. I mean, we're talking now about a kind of wider freedom of movement here, which is very important as well. I think people traveling around the world and using their talents is a very good thing. And there are still too many restrictions. You mentioned the United States. There's an example. I mean, United States, I think I have much to admire about the United States. But obviously in terms of the question of the labor market and access to the labor market and restrictions and all this sort of thing, there's a bit of work to be done.
Okay. Pensions, for example. The economy is fragile. People don't have a lot of spare cash to be exploring new territories and moving from one country to another necessarily. And they have this administrative burden to carry with them every time they move country as well. Are we going to see a single pension scheme across Europe, for example, Jean?
Well, not in the immediate future. I think if we look at sort of recent legislation where we were even trying on portability of of pensions, and this isn't your state pension. There are already arrangements in place, for people to be able to move and take their state pension with them. But, their own sort of either private pensions or the ones that they've accrued during their, as a result of their work. And you saw really there, some real barriers coming down on people not wanting to actually make this easier. We've managed to get some improvement on it. But, I think we have to move to this feeling that, people need to be able to take their accumulated rights with them.
Okay.
Because otherwise you end up with people who've paid into numerous sort of pension funds.
Okay.
Nothing at the end of it.
Timothy, do you think this could actually be driven by the private sector in the end? If we're talking about an economic need, a business need, and the opportunity for private services to be offered in terms of portability of pensions, for example, is there a role for the private sector which isn't being used or maximized at the moment?
There probably is, and again, it's a question of how internationalized this can be. We had enough problems in the UK alone, just speaking of one country, in trying to organise our pension reforms and pension changes, trying to combine the sort of state involvement together with the private suppliers. Now, trying to broaden that out across the whole of Europe and trying to make this something that works to everybody's satisfaction, bearing in mind the different retirement ages, bearing in mind things like the attitudes that are taken towards pensions and taxation in so many different countries as well. I think that's a very tall order. I think it's a bit above my pay grade, and I'm not quite sure that I will achieve it before I take my pension.
Where would you take your pension? Siegfried, what would you do to make mobility easier for workers?
Look, it's also about very simple, very concrete things. If, for example, a job center in Finland would only advertise the jobs which are available in a company in a shipyard in Finland, then of course it's much harder for say people in Croatia who are laid off at the shipyard in Croatia to apply for those jobs. So very often it's about providing information, and not necessarily in a centralized European hub or website or so on, but also in the regions, in the city, providing the necessary information, informing people concerning the legal constraints, and providing the information in languages which are accessible to other people. So very often it's about small concrete things which put you in the position of being able to apply for a job in a country different than the country that you're coming from.
Okay, Louise, do you have a question?
Yes, I have. How can the free of movement can be protected?
Jean, in a general sense, how can, let's talk about this in a communications way, how do you protect the freedom movement from the likes of Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen, who will mobilise this come election cycle?
I think part of it is actually people knowing more and having more contact with people who are moving. That requires some work. It requires some work, whether it's on the level of local authorities, sort of communities. As Timothy was saying earlier, this doesn't work simply by itself.
So it's an education process.
It's partly an education process. It's also a question, I think, about being clear about rights, and that's people who are moving, and in terms of good administration. I mean, if we really improved the administration on a lot of the issues around benefits, etc., we wouldn't have this creation of mythology that comes in, where sort of certain newspapers will publish stuff as if it's a matter of fact, where they know I'm trying to be polite, they know full well it's not. And I think that sort of human contact and seeing ourselves within this, I think, particularly saying, from your British perspective, we have this view that people sort of come to us, descend upon us. We never look at it, that we move, that we also take advantage. 1 in 10 British citizens potentially living abroad. We've got a lot of people as well moving within the European Union, people who retire to various parts of the European Union, and who see this as a perfect matter of course for them. People coming to the UK, how dare they? So I think, we do need to see this in the round and to see ourselves as part of those who move.
Timothy, you spoke about communities and integration. Language is clearly an issue. People go to another country and they don't learn the language and they don't integrate, and there's always going to be this separation of culture. How do you solve that problem?
Well, I think with great difficulty. On the one hand, you can be lazy about it from a British perspective and assume that everybody's going to be trying to speak English.
Don't they?
Of course, no. But it is of course gratifying in one sense that an awful lot of people, when there were big changes in Central Europe, chose to move from a particular language as a second language to English instead. And that was very gratifying. Indeed, most of the people I have met who were in that situation seem to be able to speak it and write it at least as well as we can ourselves, and I'm very gratified. The issue about language, though, is, of course, obviously always going to be an interesting barrier. But I think that education also ought to be geared to make sure that even the lazier British view of this is changed, and that education does concentrate on providing European languages to more of our young people.
Okay.
And I think that's something which we ought to be doing.
Should we start earlier?
I think we probably should start earlier. And, there's a mixed view in the education establishment about this, but I think there's nothing wrong with it. I think it's important that the British should not just rely on everybody else speaking their language.
Okay. There's some reports done recently by one of the lobby companies in Brussels looking at how the influence of language works in the business environment. So if you present in Spanish to a Spanish company, which would seem fairly obvious, you're something like 60% more likely to get the business than if you're pitching an equivalent bid but speaking Italian. We have an economic incentive to do this as well. Coming from Romania, Siegfried, you talked about trust and the perceptions of the historic perceptions of Romania as a country which didn't have the legal systems, the legal process necessary for secure business, for example. How do you see this changing, and what's the direct benefit?
Look, I see that changing, and absolutely the rule of law, a predictable legal framework is essential for any company to invest in any country, absolutely. But I see this changing, and it's also the European institutions, the European Commissions, those who have the rights to look into it, to evaluate it, who are saying that the institutions in Romania are doing their job and fulfilling their mission better and better. There still exist risks. The progress is not irreversible. We need to make sure that the country stays on the right track. That's why its judicial system is being monitored, and rightly so. I think, the priority shouldn't be to lift that monitoring. No, the priority should be that those countries, Romania, but also Bulgaria, fulfill their obligations and make sure that whoever invests in the country invests in a predictable business environment in which the rule of law functions equally for everyone.
Okay, do you think that, Timothy, do you think that the lessons were learned from Bulgaria and Romania coming in at a stage where they weren't perhaps ready for the legal systems? Have we learned from that, and are we at a more mature phase in terms of integration?
I think we probably are. There were, of course, a lot of concerns about that. Some of those concerns were justified and some were not, but there were a lot of concerns, and I think it is quite correct that anybody who does join the European Union does have to have, if you like, acceptable arrangements in place and acceptable understandings of how the legal system should operate and so on. I think it is quite a challenge too for countries that have actually come from a background in which they have had either dictatorships, or they have had sort of single-party states, or systems which have not actually been so open and democratic. And they've come, up. I mean, they need a lot of praise for this, their ability to come forward and to actually offer themselves in a different way. But I think we still have to be very careful about this.
Okay. Louisa, let me ask you, if you were to move to Germany, for example, I'm presuming you don't speak German, do you? No?
No.
Okay, so you're going to move to Germany. Would you feel comfortable that you could make it work in terms of getting a job, application process, getting social security benefits if you needed them?
Yes, I like to move in Germany because I know this is a country who make a good decision, and I'm sure that the law never break up.
Okay.
And the freedom of movement is respected.
Okay, Jose, a lot of Spanish people were invited to come and work in Germany, and they were told when they got there they would have benefits and jobs, training waiting for them, then the money ran out really quickly. What do we do to fix social mobility?
I think in Spain we have a huge crisis. To fix that problem, we need to get a better development.
Okay, Jean, the sense that we have huge unemployment across Europe, and yet we have millions of vacancies across Europe as well, which we can't fill. There's something really broken in this system. What is it?
I think the part of it is actually matching up and really wanting to make it work. I think there are moves going on at the moment with EURES, which the body which works on sort of cross-border employment issues, moves to actually try and improve that they do have to advertise jobs more widely, as was being mentioned earlier on, the way in which our national employment systems work. And I think we also need to actually value the skills that people bring us. One of the things that really concerns me at the moment within the European Union is a lot of people exercise their right to free movement, and that's great. I mean, I think if you were young in Spain and, wondering what the hell you did with your life, you go to the UK, you work, you learn English, at least gives you something to then develop. But when I look at the skills that are wasted in the European Union by the number of people who do have a high level of education, and that, you think we've probably got some of the best qualified sort of, coffee bar workers in the world. And I think
and
that's
we're grateful
really
for them,
sad.
let me tell
you.
Yeah,
the coffee's great, but I'd love to feel that they were actually using their other skills.
Okay, Timothy, in your party in the UK, Ian Duncan Smith, for example, has really reformed the benefit system in a way which is fundamental and difficult for many people on the lower pay scale. But the long-term objective is to get people motivated to work and not rely on benefits.
Yes.
Is there a lesson for the rest of Europe in this?
Well, I think, we don't want to be sort of trying to tell the rest of Europe what to do. But I would say that I think that the whole universal benefits system has been very controversial, of course, but I think it is very important, and part of that is, of course, the encouragement of people to look for work. I think there's nothing worse, actually. Okay, there are some people who would argue that this is a sort of, the government trying to sort of bully people. But the truth is, there's nothing worse, in my view, than people who have got some talent, got some skills, but are simply not deploying them because they have not been encouraged to do so.
Okay.
And I think that hopefully the system will work well in that sense.
Okay. The United States as well is focusing on something which is like the Peace Corps again, Siegfried, where they're trying to get unemployed youth in particular and recent graduates into a form of educational provision, working in inner city schools, this kind of thing as well. Do we need a kind of civil service, a community program for everyone coming out of university, coming out of high school?
Look, absolutely. But the point is, we should not only manage that, we should try to prevent it. I mean, we should try to equip young people while they are still in school with the right skills so that they find a job afterwards. Because if you're getting unemployed, just managing unemployment, I mean, that's too late, There is no bigger drama for a young person aged 25 than not having a job, not having a perspective in life, not being able to plan and so on. I mean, that's a disadvantage if you're unemployed for a couple of years in your 20s that you're going to carry with you for the rest of your life. So the question is, how can we prevent that? By making the business environment more attractive, by supporting enterprises, SMEs, entrepreneurs, SMEs, young entrepreneurs, by equipping the people in school with the right skills which they need to find a job afterwards. So for me, it's more about, and the kinds of measures which you were suggesting were right, but for me, it's more about preventing youth unemployment than just managing it after it happens.
Do we need to change the European mentality to unemployment in the first instance? I was dealing with someone in an interview last week.
I think we need to change the mentality concerning entrepreneurship. I mean, if you try and you fail once, you definitely have a higher likelihood of succeeding in the second time. Okay. So this stigma of failure, which we're having in the Europe, and look a point where the US is different, and I think there the US is right, not stigmatizing failure of young entrepreneurs.
Ariana Huffington was tweeting with this morning.
Oh.
Jean, exactly this. Jean, the sense that people are not prepared for the workplace should they lose their job, and they go on to social security benefits. Well, we have a group from Coca-Cola here today in the Parliament protesting about having been laid off by Coca-Cola, even though the company was profitable as well. Do we need to reform our labour laws as well to get this mobility across Europe?
I think it's not necessarily a question of labour laws. I think it's a question about sort of almost how do you handle this whole question? One of the things that comes up when we talk about social security and social security reform is how do you support people in times of transition? How do you support them when they are coming from school to college, coming from college to the workplace? What support is in there for them at that point? And I think that's a really important area. If people do lose their jobs, I think the question about the quality of training and training linked to labour market opportunities is really, really important.
Okay.
And I think there's some fascinating
Timothy,
stuff coming
the
from young
Austrians
people
are good at
themselves on
this.
that.
The Austrians have the system of training and apprenticeship as soon as you. Why don't we do this across Europe? They have the lowest youth unemployment.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think we should. And I think certainly, just speaking for Britain now, we have actually moved very strongly into the whole area of apprenticeship again. When I was young, apprentices was everything really, and then they seemed to go out completely, and I think that was very bad. I think you need to have apprenticeships, and I'm very pleased the British government's doing that. I hope others will do the same.
Okay, that's where with Siegfried.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. That works in Austria, it works in Germany, in the Netherlands. But what works in one country does not necessarily and automatically mean works exactly in the same form in another country. We should definitely exchange best practices, and apprenticeships I think are part of the solution, definitely. But in the long term, we need more good university graduates if we want to succeed in that knowledge-based economy and facing the global competition.
Okay, the knowledge-based economy, it should be back to basics. That we have lost sight of what the freedom movement was about. It's been mixed up with issues to do with immigration, when really it should be about building employment, building the economy, building future for millions of Europeans, particularly young Europeans who so badly need good quality jobs at this point as well. The nature of people moving as well, it's not just about security, it's about making sure that there's mobility for those who are moving to the right place for the right reasons as well. And that Schengen itself, it should remain, but in times of emergency, the structure is already in place for national states to take action when that's needed as well. So the sophistication of criminals as well, we got to be one step ahead and not one step behind, and PNR and other data systems can help Europe and member states deal with this as well. Our values, the underpinning sense of what Europe is, and the capacity for Europeans to work in other countries, knowing that they'll be protected by the rule of law, knowing they'll have opportunities, and knowing that there is a long-term benefit for their pension provision and social security as well when it's needed. But the differences are wide. We don't have the same pension scheme, we don't have the same retirement age, we don't have the same employment rights across Europe to some degree as well, and this is still a work in progress as well. Let me thank our guests today as well, Timothy Kirkhope, Jean Lambert, Siegfried Murasin, our students also. Thank you so much for your time today, much appreciated.